One thing about these footprint studies, they really do paint this utopia. It's like the sloth human paper where they were having a good time and they're making fun of the sloths like a Monty Python skit, And that may be true. I don't know.
Humans really are out there, just in their birthday suits, bare feet with nothing else with them, romping around the mud flats with sloths. They're usually out there for a reason, and they usually have things with them. A lot of archaeologists often question, okay, well, why don't we see something like a hearth? Why don't we see stone tools that we can recognize?
It's about origins, and origins is always pretty sexy. I mean, we're at the cusp of a potential paradigm shift for sure.
Bienvenidos. This is Encounter Culture from the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. I'm your host and editor of El Palacio magazine, Emily Withnall. Ever since I heard that there were footprints at White Sands that had been dated at 23,000 years old, far older than humans were thought to be on the North American continent, I was captivated. Admittedly, I did not read any scientific articles about this at the time, though I did peruse magazine articles that covered the topic, including, of course, an article in the summer 2023 issue of El Palacio, linked for you in the show notes. And it seems that everywhere I go now, I hear that human life on this continent is older than we thought. Most recently, I even heard an artist visiting Santa Fe mention it during an event. Clearly, I am not alone in my amazement. What if the footprints are 23,000 years old? And what would that mean about everything else we know? Humans are hardwired for storytelling, and there is nothing better than encountering an unexpected plot twist that upends everything we thought we knew to that point. Whether we are learning about new technologies or using those technologies to look backward at the past, science often delivers exciting stories, possibilities, and new ways of understanding the world. But what is less talked about by non-scientists is how very messy science is. Besides the fact that humans are limited by what we can perceive and how those perceptions are shaped by our environments, science is constantly in motion. Often, as soon as we make one discovery, we learn more that challenges or complicates our previous understandings. Or, new discoveries shift the questions we were asking to begin with. As with any scientific inquiry, the story of the White Sands footprints is not over, and the research that has been done so far is incomplete. To talk with me about why this is the case, I was joined by Dr. John Taylor-Montoya, Director of the Office of Archaeological Studies, and Dr. David Rachal, geoarchaeology consultant in southern New Mexico. Together, they explain why there are two different schools of thought on how old the footprints are, why carbon dating isn't always conclusive, and what still needs to be researched to determine how long humans have been in North America. And just a heads up, we're going to be referencing a few photos from the site in this conversation. If you want to see them for yourself, please visit the show notes for this episode at podcast.nmculture.org. Admittedly, when I heard the footprints might not be 23,000 years old, I was deflated. And to be honest, given that the research is ongoing, I still hope it's true because I'm hooked on the plot twist. But perhaps listening to this conversation will lead you to a deeper appreciation of how differing perspectives in the scientific community are a secret superpower. Welcome to Encounter Culture. Thank you both for being here with me. Do you want to start us off with some brief intros of who you each are?
Sure. I'm Dr. John Taylor-Montoya. I'm the director of the Office of Archaeological Studies, and I've been studying peopling of Americas for close to 20 years now.
I'm Dr. David Rachal. I'm a geoarchaeology consultant in southern New Mexico, and I've been doing geoarchaeology work now for about 12 years, and I've been working on the White Sands footprints in the Tularosa Basin off and on since 2014.
What was the earliest sign for each of you that you would go into your respective professions? So, for example, did 7-year-old David know that you wanted to do what you're doing now?
I think 20-year-old David knew what he wanted to do after taking his first geomorphology class. So yeah, 20 years old is what I wanted to do. I don't even know why I was into fossilized soils. It's such a nerd thing. But I don't know. I'm having fun. Hopefully it continues.
Yeah, for me, it started out pretty early. So I've always been, art has been a love of mine, but also, I've been fascinated by archaeology since a young age. And I remember checking out books in the library, in elementary school. I think even before I could read, I would just look at the pictures of, King Tut's tomb and things like that. So I thought I was going to be an Egyptologist, though. That's what I thought. Yeah. And of course, now my role is a little bit different. So as the director of the Office of Archaeological Studies, I'm actually in charge of a much broader, research program where we don't do just one particular area. We do all kinds of different studies of all different time periods here in New Mexico. But that's, again, why I'm glad that, Dave is still out there, fighting the good fight and doing the good science, because this is something that, is still, very much an interest to me.
Okay. Well, that's a perfect segue, because I wanted to start off by asking you both, when were the footprints discovered in White Sands and who discovered them?
Ooh.
That's a good question. So when we first encountered them, we were working together on White Sands Missile Range for the Army, actually. And Stan Berryman was the archaeologist who was contracting us for the Army to work out there, and he brought it to our attention. The footprints were initially reported, to my knowledge, in the early 20th century. And in fact, they were reported by a hunter who had been out there. And they were referred to back then in a newspaper article as Bigfoot prints.
Oh, wow.
But shortly after that, they were verified as something other than Bigfoot prints. And the Army had actually built a fence around that particular little area of footprints on the range. And to my knowledge, not much had been done with those footprints, with anything on the range, until, Stan contracted us specifically in 2014 to go out there and do a systematic survey of the footprints themselves, and also any paleontology we might encounter out there. And of course, the geology and geoarchaeology of the area as well.
Okay. So what was your reaction when you first saw them?
Wow. I mean, it's pretty cool that, these footprints can be recorded. They're 20-something thousand years old, and they're just right there at the surface.
And I have to say, we had a team out there. And so it was Dave and I and a couple of other scientists, and all of our reactions, I think, were wow at the time.
And a photo of them is, can you bring up photo 1, please? So that's the set of sloth tracks that we worked on.
Oh, wow.
With our project
Okay.
in 2014, 2015. Okay. Yeah, I could see where someone could come out there and go, oh, these are Bigfoot tracks. Pretty amazing. They're kidney bean shaped. They have a pretty long gait, but that's a sloth walking upright a very short distance.
Yeah. And so listeners can kind of visualize this. The footprints are they're not imprints. They're, what's the reverse of that?
It's a cast.
It's a cast, yeah. It's like elevated above the actual surface of the ground. And yeah, they're huge.
Now, one thing about the prints, when you find them in that elevated context, what that's telling you is there's been a lot of wind erosion, and the original surface has been removed away. And then the print, which was originally pressed into the soft sediment, which was the topographic low, has been inverted to the topographic high. Right? So when you're out there walking around, the original surface of both human beings and the megafauna walked on has long since been gone, been removed by erosion.
Right. So in terms of these being actual sloth prints, I have a couple of questions about that. One, don't sloths have claws? And also, those are so far apart. So those are not like current sloths, right? Like the sloths that we have on our planet right now.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so these would be giant ground sloths, so an extinct form of sloth that would have been around during the late Pleistocene, not only here, but throughout the Americas. And yes, what Dave just said is very important. Our listeners should keep that in the back of their minds for this entire conversation as we go forward. This is a very dynamic landscape, and the gypsum sediment that these prints are made in is very friable, meaning that it's easily crushed or malleable, and also water soluble. And so, you have to think of this area as being waterlogged or damp. It's a lake shoreline or near a lake, or actually, underwater at times. And so as the animals are moving around in there, sometimes the prints that they make, aren't those nice little cement casts that you make with your kids for the garden, where you put their little hands or their feet in there and they make a nice little cast of their hands. The animals, these large, heavy beasts are sliding around in mud sometimes. That's one of the things that you have to contend with out there. But there are many that you can identify to the type of animal: camel, sloth. The elephant footprints are kind of unmistakable out there. Those are ones that are pretty unambiguous.
So the most common are the elephant tracks.
Okay.
And that's just because they're really big animals and it's real easy for them to leave a trace.
Yeah.
But you can find a saber-toothed tiger or a North American lion, dire wolves, which I think those things are really hard to identify, and but they're supposedly out there. Sloth tracks. It's pretty remarkable. And a lot of times, when you see these surfaces, particularly when they're pedestaled, you have to keep in mind that you're looking at a palimpsest surface. These trackway surfaces are very thin. Erosion comes through and removes the sediment, and it's exhuming the surface. It's eroding out the tracks, and a lot of the tracks are popping up differentially. So you could be looking at 2 or 3 different track surfaces superimposed on top of one another. It's really, really complicated.
Okay, interesting. And there are human tracks among the sloth and elephant and dire wolf and everything that you just mentioned?
Yes, but it's a question of if the human footprints are impressed into the sediment and they're around megafauna tracks that are pedestaled, they might not have formed at the same time. They might not be associated.
I see.
And that's just because it's a complicated landscape. Gypsum's tricky. It's a soluble mineral, so it will move around a lot. Now, there are areas where you have intact surfaces, and it's very possible that if you find human footprints in that area of those types of tracks, and they could be coetaneous, meaning the same age. Typically a geoarchaeologist goes out an archaeological site. We want to know if the artifact's been moved around a lot or are they in their original place, right? When the geoarchaeologist goes out to trackways, they have to assess if the human tracks and the megafauna tracks are coetaneous. And what that means, did they form at the same time in the geologic record? And that's a tall order because there's so many things going on out there. There's a lot of erosion and sedimentation. Surfaces can get exhumed and then buried again, and it can be misleading. It can be very, very tricky. So that's what I mean by coetaneous.
So I know that part of what we're talking about today is maybe, I don't know if it would be correct to characterize it as a scientific debate or a conversation around the dates of the actual human footprints and how we know how old they are or what the process has been to discover how old they are.
I would say a debate.
Debate. Okay.
It's not a conversation. We've passed that point. I would say a debate. And I think, no one is arguing that they're not Pleistocene in age, right? They are, right? The argument is about, is it last glacial maximum? And that's around 25,000 years ago to 20,000 years ago. That's during the last ice age. At that time, you would have massive glaciers coming down, covering up a lot of the upper Midwest. In New Mexico, it would look a lot like Silver City, that drive from Silver City up to Glenwood, where the trees would be lower down the mountain slopes. You would have grassy basin floors and the lake would be present, right? That's the last glacial maximum. The other argument or the other idea is that, well, maybe they're terminal Pleistocene, and that's around 15,000 to 12,000 years ago. And we have a lot of data to support that. We have no data to support that idea that people came down here during the last glacial maximum. So that's the argument, whether they're terminal Pleistocene or last glacial maximum.
Okay. What are the different ideas or thoughts about how old these tracks are? And what's the difference between those?
So what we think we know, based on genetic models, the physical archaeological record of North America, and these geologic studies that showed when these migration corridors opened up, that people were here sometime around 16,000 years or later. So if we were here 21 to 23,000 years ago, we've missed thousands of years.
Okay. But there are some scientists who are saying that the tracks might be that old. The
Yes.
23,000
Yes.
years old. Okay. So are there two camps then around this debate?
Well, there's a rebel alliance, which is me and a few other people, and and then there's the empire. I'm just joking. There's two camps. That's right, for sure. My biggest beef. I don't care if people were here 23, 21,000 years ago.
Right.
My biggest beef is about the plant and what they're dating. Right. It's not how they're dating it. Radiocarbon dating is really well known. It's a really respected technique. It's been around a long time. It's just about the plant. The plant has a bad reputation for being unreliable. And the other issue I have is the context of the seeds themselves.
Okay. So let's dive into the seeds. So can you kind of give an overview about how these footprints are being dated?
Can you bring up photograph 4? There you go. That's a picture. The upper left is a picture of the seeds. The bottom one is the seed layer that they're dating. So they're in this mudflat depositional type of environment. And mudflats are really great places to have the preservation of footprints because mudflats are submerged when the lake is really, really high. If the lake dries out, then the mudflat's exposed. And when it's exposed, all it is just spongy, soft sediment that's composed of silts and clays. So when the megafauna or people walk across it, their footprints just squish down into it. And if the lake rebounds or, say, wind blows in onto that tracked surface, or if there's a river by it that floods and drops out sediment, it buries the prints. So if that process repeats over time, it creates a stratified record of human footprints. And that's what we're seeing at Locality 2. That's their site that's really gotten a lot of critical acclaim. Now, in that, you have these seed layers. So you have footprints that are stratified, and in between each one of those footprint tracked horizons, you have seed layers, like up there in the upper left, and they're composed of Ruppia cirrhosa seeds. And Ruppia is an aquatic plant. It lives underwater, and it has a bad reputation for being unreliable because it can't really use atmospheric CO2 for photosynthesis. It doesn't get its carbon from the atmosphere. What it does is it gets the carbon from the water. And that water is artificially old because it's contaminated with bicarbonate from the limestone in the basin. So it pulls in that artificially old carbon during photosynthesis. That carbon gets pulled into the plant's tissue. And if you radiocarbon date it, it'll come back thousands of years older than what it's supposed to be. So, can I finish with one more thing?
Yeah.
I'm going to take it home here. All right. So if we all three got in a car and we went to the Tularosa Basin right now, and we go to the Salt Creek where Ruppia still grows, and I get John, get some waders, and he's out there and he picks a bunch of plants. We send it off for radiocarbon dating. That modern plant can come back 8,000 years older than what it's supposed to be.
Wow.
Now, it is variable. If you go around different parts of the little wetland you sampled, it could range anywhere from 2,000 to 9,000 years old. So it's unreliable. And that's a big issue, and that's a scientific fact.
Interesting. So are there other ways of dating things?
Let's talk about the second issue first.
Okay.
So you got this plant that lives underwater, and it pulls in old carbon. It can look really, really old, and it can be young, right? It's not a good material to base a chronology on, and typically the general rule of thumb is just stay away from it, right? The other issue about the plant is how it propagates. It's underwater, and during certain times of the year, it grows little flowers. And these flowers are designed to break off if there's just the slightest bit of turbulence. So if it's flowering and a storm comes through and the water's shaking, the plant will break apart, and all of those stems and seeds create these floating mats. Once it does that, it turns into the tumbleweed of the lake. It can float up to days, weeks to months, and it can go from one side of the lake to the other. So what happens is the plant's breaking apart. It can be washed in from the west side onto the east side into their site and being deposited into the trackway site. And we know that because we're finding lake balls. Those are those Ruppia seed balls there.
Okay.
And that's from the plant breaking apart, being pushed across the lake. It gets caught up in the tidal zone, and wave action rolls them into balls, and it mixes all that material into these little spheres. They can be the size of a ping pong ball. They can be the size of a baseball. But the point is, the plant didn't grow in the site. It's coming in from deeper water.
Interesting. So just so that I'm clear, are you saying that there might be stratified footprints that are already kind of layered, and then the seeds are kind of seeping in? Or
They're being washed in by storms. So you have this scenario where you have people walking across the shoreline and you're getting all this artificially aged material injected into their footprints.
Okay.
What that does is it makes them appear older than what they really are.
I see. Okay. Interesting. Okay. So we have these seeds that are hard to date. We have the movement of the seeds across the water. Is dating the seeds the only way to tell how old the footprints are?
Well, that's all you got. And it's not that people haven't tried to find terrestrial material. That's really the only way to get around the hard water effect, is that you need to find something terrestrial to compare the aquatic seed dates to, right? So if you find, say, charcoal or maybe some insect part in a seed layer and you date that and then you compare that to the aquatic seeds, if they're the same age, then you know that the hard water effect wasn't an issue at the time. But if there's a difference in age by 8,000 years, then the hard water was present and you can use that to correct the age.
Okay. So, and just so listeners are aware, the hard water effect is what you were just describing about the limestone or the older elements being absorbed.
Yes, you have carbon in the water derived from these ancient limestone deposits. And so that's, of course, those are potentially millions of years old. Theoretically, there are a lot of different ways that you could attempt to date an archaeological site. And what Dave is getting at here is that, unfortunately, what you are at the mercy of is what is deposited at the site. Because again, we want to get to this question of association. And this is a fundamental question of all archaeological sites, and dating things, no matter what they are or what material you're dating, is the material that you are trying to derive a date from. Was it deposited at the same time as the object or thing that you're trying to actually get a date for? But again, getting back to the theme that we had mentioned in the beginning, so locality 2 is a pretty good depositional environment, but it still is subject to these geological processes that can sometimes fool us. My former advisor, when he was talking about this debate, said something very simple but very apt. Mother Nature has a way of fooling us sometimes. And then you have a material that they're using to date the site that is not necessarily reliable. So you have these 3 different areas that all have their variables. And one of the things that Dave and I, from the very beginning when we were out there studying this area in 2014, is we recognize the fact that this is a very complex area with some very complex problems that you have to go through as a scientist before you can get to the fun stuff of interpreting the archaeology and paleontology that you see out there. Some first principles things, how the site was formed, what are the different processes, what are the variables, and can you control for all of those different variables, and can you explain them or can you correct for them? And so our approach from the very beginning, and this is something that Dave has carried forward in his research now, is you need to approach it from that perspective of, let's discover first, what are the processes that formed what we're seeing, what was deposited out there, and how it looks to us today. Because how it looks to us today may have been altered from what happened in the past. And so what you think you are seeing on the surface today may not be a reflection of what happened in the past that you can take at face value. You first have to do all of that detective work in order to get to that story. There is this debate about the dates, but there's also, 2 different kinds of approaches on how to solve these problems. And, I'm kind of biased because, Dave is a colleague and, someone I worked with in the past, but, I think we, worked well together because we're cut from the same cloth in terms of how we look at the problem.
So there's a lot to respond to there and to ask about, but I want to kind of circle back as I'm thinking about this debate as it exists to something you said, David, about being the Rebel Alliance. So I'm curious if you are the underdogs in this debate and why that is, or what the counter argument is when you present all of this research about the seeds and the problem with dating them.
I'm going to riff off what John was talking about here. The context is critical because they argue that the plant grew within the site. And if the plant grew within the site, there's all these assumptions. If it grew in the site in shallow, aerated water, and the water was fresh, then the hard water effect is not an issue, right? If the plant washed into the site, that's our model, right? If it washed into the site from far off sources, it's still subject to the hard water effect. And if that's the case, their chronology's off by an unknown amount. We don't know for sure. We're going to figure that out. That's the issue. The whole context of that plant is what the debate's around. Their cornerstone of their argument is that that plant grew within the site. But when you go out there and you look at the seed layers and you look at the plant bits and parts, the only thing that you find there is the tumbleweed part of the plant. You don't find roots or other parts that suggest that the plant was there growing in a sessile way. Instead, all you get are the stems and the seeds, and all that tells you is that it washed in. And that's the big argument, this controversial context that we keep going back and forth on that probably will never go away until we find a piece of terrestrial carbon in a seed layer, and we'll see which way it goes.
Interesting. Okay. So part of that difference in opinions in that argument is also based on water levels, right?
Sure.
So is there any way to know what the water levels were?
Yeah, just examining the stratigraphy. I mean, we know based on the stratigraphy of the site, the footprint site, that the lake was pretty low. It was in this phase of where the lake was regressing. It was dropping.
Okay.
Right. So, and it had to be low. I mean, as it was dropping, of course, there's times where it would rebound, but it was generally drying out. And that's when you have those exposed mudflats, and that's a really good time to have footprint preservation. Right. Well, as that's happening, you're having storms and the plant's being broken apart, and it's being washed from one side of the basin to the other and being injected into their site.
Right.
And that could make it look older than what it is. And this happens. This is not like some crazy idea. Little Borax Lake, there was an event, Little Borax Lake, 1948. Ruppia was there. Storm came through. It busted up the plant. It washed material from one side of the lake to the other, deposited on the shoreline into human footprints. And that plant dated 700 years old. So it made those prints look 700 years older than what they really were. So it can happen. It's a real weird phenomenon. This has only happened like 6 times in recorded history. I thought this was pretty interesting. After I published the paper, I don't know why I was flipping through Thoreau's Walden book, but he talks about it in page 217. He talks about lake balls. He called them curious balls. But it happens.
Wow. Okay. So on the one hand, you have your argument that the stems and the flower part of the plant are the only things that are found.
Right.
What is the other camp's argument for why they think the plants were actually growing on the site?
Well, good question. So the stem is typically attached to the seed, and they argue that that's evidence of in situ plant growth. And that's not true. That's like the fronds of like a dandelion. You know, you blow a dandelion, they fly out little parachutes and they get dispersed around. That's all you're looking at. They have no evidence. We've tried to bring that up of, okay, if the plant grew there and you have all this preservation of all this Ruppia material, where are the roots? And all you get is, they don't respond. I mean, if the plant grew there, there should be roots. It's a rooted plant. And if the plant did grow there, those roots would obliterate the trackway strata. Those roots would destroy that fine stratigraphy that the footprints are in. And this is a very dynamic, laminated environment. And the evidence is just not there that the plant grew within the site. It's not. It's not.
Okay. Wow. This is a vigorous debate. As a child, I spent many summers hiking with my family across mesas around New Mexico. We visited the big sites like Chaco Canyon and Bandelier, but we also went to lesser-known sites like Sankowi and the Puye Cliff Dwellings. These trips were fueled by my parents' interest in archaeology and New Mexico history, an interest they passed down to me. Are you also fascinated by archaeology and ancient human history? Since 1952, the New Mexico Office of Archaeological Studies has worked to identify, interpret, and share information about prehistoric and historic sites across the state. Through community outreach and educational programming, the New Mexico Office of Archaeological Studies ignites the curiosity of New Mexicans. Discover New Mexico archaeology. To learn more, visit nmarchaeology.org. Did you know? The New Mexico Culture Pass is now available to purchase online. Culture Pass gives you access to each of the 15 state museums and historic sites we feature on Encounter Culture. Whether you're a local resident or you're visiting us on your travels, reserve your Culture Pass today at nmculture.org/visit/culturepass. I do have a slight side question. I've been to White Sands. It's very windy. How has the wind not, in all this time, wiped away these prints or even the top layers of the prints?
Well, I would argue that it probably has wiped away prints. And in fact, that was one of the concerns that the Army archaeologist had when he sent us out there was how are we going to preserve these for future study, or, how are we going to manage these? And that was a big concern, is that they're subject to wind erosion. And because especially the gypsum is so friable that anything, potentially could destroy these footprints, and they are. So that is something that is happening. That's one of the aspects of this dynamic environment, is that you do have these different areas of preservation and erosion. And in fact, the White Sands Basin and those beautiful white sands that we love to go to and visit are themselves a process of those erosional events happening, just within the recent time. But if I could just take a little aside here real quickly, that gets me to one of the questions about association and the fact that you can have potentially two things from different time periods next to each other on the same surface and potentially looking like they may belong there. People not only were there in the past, but they were there continuously through the past and up and through the present and through the historic time. And you find evidence of all of those occupations on the White Sands today. And so you have prehistoric deposits there that are 1,000 years old or a few hundred years old. And they're also out there, amongst the footprints, tools, pottery sherds, as well as prints that people were making then at that point in time out on that gypsum. It's still a malleable surface. It's still subject to those same physical forces and properties that gave rise to the footprints that are very ancient. And so again, we get to this picture of this landscape, this area that is very complex.
Yeah.
And you need to interpret them in that dynamic context. It's very dangerous to go out there and you find all these surfaces and you just assume that that's just a snapshot of what it was, 20-something thousand years ago. Not to say it's not possible, but in a lot of cases out there, those surfaces are so deflated, the prints are pedestaled. It's hard to tell what's going on, and it can be misleading. One other thing I want to talk about too is that when you're out there and you do find prints, and if you look for the physical archaeological record, and the closest thing you can find are typically projectile points that are late archaic, only a couple thousand years old, maybe formative period. So when you look at the physical archaeological record near these purported human footprints, it is pretty recent.
So when I first read about these footprints, there was a lot of excitement because, the early research was perhaps pointing to these being much older than when humans are thought to have come over the land bridge. So I'm curious about that element of the debate and what makes these prints significant, even if it doesn't disprove the land bridge theory or if it proves something else.
I'll take one part and you can take the other, or we can build off each other.
Tag team.
Yeah. So you've asked a really big question. I don't know if you intended it as such, but, this actually gets to a much broader area of inquiry, which is, the peopling of the Americas. When did people arrive here and how did they do it? These were hunter-gatherers, by the way. So these are folks who are living off the land, hand to mouth. They're hunting or gathering wild plants for their food. And so for a long time, that was capped at about 12,000 years ago. Over time, there have been other discoveries that have pushed that chronology back. Additionally, there's a lot of other lines of evidence that go into answering this question. So this question isn't just an archaeological or purely archaeological question. Genetics has something to say about this. Linguistics has something to say about this. Geology has something to say about this. Climatology has something to say about this debate as well. And now, I think a conservative estimate would be somewhere around 15,000, 16,000 years ago is probably the early entry point when people came into the continent and then dispersed rapidly across both North and South America. Claims beyond that are going to push that, and sort of change how we think about things, force us to not only rethink what we thought we knew, but when you started getting into certain time periods, especially like the last glacial maximum, you also have to rethink how they were getting here and how they were surviving, because they would have to have traversed some environment, in some way other than a Beringian land bridge that looked like it did, at the end of the last ice age. And so it's not just simply you're talking about a different date, but you're actually changing the entire picture of what we think we know about, how the Americas were first inhabited. And this is a debate that's been going on for a long time, but it's a very complex question.
So, as I said before, the debate centers around whether they're last glacial maximum, 21 to 23,000 years ago, which is what we wish we knew, or if it's 15 to 12,000 years old, which is what we think we know. Either way, it's still the oldest site in New Mexico, and it's a contender to be one of the oldest sites in North America, and I don't think we need to lose sight of that. It's not like I'm going to go out there, come back and go, man, these things are like 2,000 years old. That's not true. No, it is legit Pleistocene. It's just, is it fall into when we think people got here, or is it they got here earlier and we don't know how and it just screwed up decades of research? We're at the cusp of a potential paradigm shift for sure, if this is right, so...
So for listeners who may be thinking that 15,000 years ago and 23,000 years ago sound both really long ago, what is the huge difference between these time frames in terms of dating these footprints? And why does this matter so much?
Do you want to take that on?
I'll go for it.
So I guess from my perspective, there's a whole body of evidence in research that, tends to be accepted by the vast majority of archaeologists out there that points to a particular time when we think we know, most likely when people, first arrived in Americas. So genetic studies have shown, over and over again that, the modern Native Americans are genetically related to East Asian population and probably split from an East Asian Beringian population sometime around 23,000 years ago. And then there was another genetic split sometime around 15,000 years ago into Northern Native American and Southern Native American populations, who then dispersed rapidly across the continent. So that's what the genetics is showing you, that evidence. And then also, as we talked about, the geology and the climatology. So knowing giant glaciers that were, growing in northern North America, at some points they closed up the land bridge. And at some points it was open. At some points they're growing all the way down into, the upper Midwestern United States and of course the Rocky Mountains. And so these are all areas that if people are coming down from Siberia through the land bridge, they would have had to have traversed. And so if the land bridge is closed, that's the route that's no longer open to them. And so if they are here, they have to find a new way down. So they have to either go down the coast, the Pacific coast, or, some people propose that maybe they came across the Pacific. There are also some other, ideas in the past that came across the Atlantic. But, again, the genetics would argue against the Atlantic crossing. And so, again, from my perspective, this would change not just the number, the date, but we would have to rethink everything about what we think we know about the first people that came here into North America, where they were from, how they got here, how they could have possibly done it, how they survived, what it looked like when they first arrived here in North America. Because, again, the difference in your environment, your ecology between 23,000 and, say, 12,000 is going to be huge, not just in terms of, like, the weather, whether it's, there are glaciers, it's colder, it's warmer, lakes are drying or they're high or whatever. But also at this time, you have mass extinctions going on. So the kinds of animals and plants that you would encounter would be completely different as well. So it changes everything for us as scientists who are trying to study this problem and make sense of it and gather the evidence and create these models and do our research. That's why, we talk about a paradigm shift. It's not just those little numbers.
I think it's about origins, and origins is always pretty sexy, and everybody's interested in it. The peopling of the New World, that particular field, is very contentious. There's a lot of arguing back and forth. What John's saying is absolutely right. I'm totally on board with that. I think a lot of our understanding, we have a lot of hypotheses out there that have been around for a long period of time that'll be overthrown. The big one is the overkill hypothesis. When people show up on the scene, the megafauna, they die off, right? And if people got here 21 to 23,000 years ago, maybe even older, we don't know, then the megafauna die-off wasn't the result of human beings. That was something else, and we don't know what it is. One thing about these footprint studies, they really do paint this utopia of people living with the megafauna. It's like the sloth human paper where they were having a good time and they're making fun of the sloths, like a Monty Python skit, And that may be true. I don't know. But it'll turn over so many things, and that's why it's important, and it's about origins, and everybody's interested about that. And I don't know. One thing I would like to talk about, if we have a little more time, the Tularosa Basin is not some random basin in Nevada. I mean, there's military facilities there. You got White Sands Missile Range. You got Fort Bliss Military Reservation. And both those localities, they're like the size of Delaware or maybe Rhode Island 2 times over. So they're large. They have a CRM program that's been in effect for, 40 years. There's been hundreds of thousands of acres surveyed, tons of backhoe trenching, testing, thousands of hearth features dated. And I guess when I think about the 21 to 23,000-year-old footprints, I just always go, what are we doing wrong? How come we haven't found that? Because, if you have the preservation of human footprints, you should have organics associated with occupation, a hearth. You should have some, I would say, John, correct me if I'm wrong, but you would think you'd have some kind of lithic technology, right? And we're not finding that. And it's not like we haven't looked. I get it. It took 20 years for Louis Leakey to find Nutcracker Man. We've been at it for 40 years, and we haven't found anything. Systematically looking at it, lots of data. And I'm skeptical, you know.
Yeah.
So, that brings up a good point about how this fits into the larger debate. So, unfortunately, in that respect, this falls under, a category that a lot of other claims for great antiquity in the Americas in general fall under, which is these sites tend to be anomalous, and they tend to have, very sort of unique preservational qualities to them. And so a lot of them come under immediate scrutiny for that. And then, many of them also suffer from the fact that, you don't have associated material culture or material culture that's in any way sort of diagnostic or recognizable. So what we would like to see as archaeologists in general is we like patterns. And we also like to see something that sort of fits with multiple lines of evidence. And so that's what Dave's kind of getting to here. So, all right, we have this wonderful environment where we've got, these footprints that are preserved. So where's the other human stuff here? Humans really are out there, just in their birthday suits, bare feet with nothing else with them, romping around the mud flats with sloths. They're usually out there for a reason, and they usually have things with them. And, I don't know about you guys, but we leave stuff everywhere. We drop things accidentally on purpose. That's how the archaeological record is formed. And so, for a lot of these sites, a lot of archaeologists often question, okay, well, where's the culture? Where's the pattern? Why don't we see something like a hearth? Why don't we see stone tools that we can recognize? Why don't we see anything that you would typically expect at any other archaeological site, or in this case, like an archaeological district? As he alluded to, Dave, earlier, there are like hundreds of acres of footprints on White Sands. And out of all of that, if you do have human occupation there that's so well preserved, why haven't we found other kinds of evidence for it? That would go along with this. And again, maybe getting back to the earlier question of why would this be such a big deal? whatever you would find at 23,000 years ago would potentially not look like anything we've seen before. And so you would be discovering like a new cultural tradition in North America. But again, we should see evidence of that in some way, shape, or form. And so that's very legitimate. And that's something that is sort of at the core of a lot of these, claims for very early antiquity, very, very old sites in North and South America.
Yeah, we need to correct the hard water effect problem because it's there to some degree. We don't know by how much, but it is there. And then we also need to find some physical archaeological material. We do. I mean, I think that's where we got to go to accept this. I've, a few critics, they're they used antler bone. They didn't use stone tools. Like, I don't know. That's one guy told me. And then the other person was like, they're just walking across the landscape. They're not going to drop anything. It's like, well, the archaic people did. What makes the LGM folks any different? I mean,
right.
We're always on the scene mucking things up, That's just what we do.
Right. Well, it just happens, right? I mean, we use things, we drop things, as we're going across the landscape, and I mean, not to get too far afield, but there is the possibility that, they're out there just playing around, but that's highly unlikely that all of these deposits would be from people just taking a leisurely stroll across the mud flats. Again, hunter-gatherers are living hand-to-mouth. It can be a hard way to live. You're in a survival game all the time. And so they would probably be out there with a purpose. They'd be out there to collect seasonal resources or, for some kind of purpose like that. And if they're doing that, then they're making tools, maintaining tools, and so you would see some kind of trace. And even if they're using organic tools, which is,
it's possible,
totally possible, they're still making those organic tools with stone tools and other kinds of materials. And so you'd see the byproducts of that somewhere. Somewhere out there would be, the evidence for this. And maybe, not even in the footprint area, but, in 2014, 2015, we did geological studies on the west side, and we found buried surfaces that, date to other time periods. So there are other areas that you could explore for these kinds of things as well. But no, that's a very legitimate thing.
All I know is if you put me into a time machine, you dropped me out there 21 to 23,000 years ago, I'd be freaked out. I mean, that would be a very, very dangerous environment to be running around in. Mm-hmm. And you would stay away from the lake margin as much as possible because that's where the predators are going to be.
Mm-hmm.
It would be scary. It really would be scary. So I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah.
One last really quick question. Is the nature of this debate and these two different camps that are dating the footprints differently, is it motivating both camps to keep looking and researching to try to come up with a more certain answer about how old these tracks are?
The Rebel Alliance feels that way. I don't know about the Empire. We've proposed things. We recently published a paper in Paleo America, came out like a couple of days ago, bringing up a lot of these issues and even new issues. And, when you bring up something, I feel like it's a scientist's responsibility to try to address them. And we got a response back and, I didn't get that impression. We're right. We're right, and you constantly have to keep checking yourself and you constantly have to be looking at your data in different ways. And, I could be totally wrong. I mean, I could be, but I do think I have enough evidence to indicate that the plant washed into the site. And if that's the case, they didn't fix the hard water effect. It's a context issue, but there will be more to come. This isn't going away. And I would say to the listeners, before you jump on one, before you go with the Empire or you sign on board with the Rebel Alliance, give it 10 years or so to let the dust settle and make your mind up then because we're only just getting started.
Yeah.
So
that's the cool thing about this is that, yes, hopefully it will lead to more discoveries, more work. 15 years ago, we didn't know that those footprints were there. Now we do.
Yeah.
And so who knows what else might turn up.
There's value to the outrageous geologic hypothesis. There's value to the outrageous archaeological hypothesis because all it's going to do is more people are going to invest more money, more time, and we're going to really understand that basin and all its processes in leaps and bounds. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, it's just a dead zone. And now there's a lot of interest from a lot of people. And that's a good thing. I think we need to think about that. I mean, it's a positive. So
yeah.
And arguing about it, it's not to be mean or or anything like that. It's just it's a part of the process.
Yeah, no, it's exciting.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, it is a significant finding.
Yeah.
And we just need to kind of fine-tune that chronology a bit and see where it shakes out. I mean, put up a building around it. I mean, it needs to be protected, and people should be able to see it. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, well, thank you both so much for being here and having this conversation with me.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Now that you are thoroughly steeped in the details of carbon dating Ruppia seed balls, the hard water effect, lake movement, and more, where do you fall in the White Sands footprint debate? If you want to join me down the rabbit hole of White Sands footprint research, check out the links in our show notes. Thanks for listening. Encounter Culture is a production of the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. Our producer is Andrea Klunder at the Creative Imposter Studios. This season is produced and edited by Andrea Klunder and Alex Riegler, with additional editing by Monica Brain. Our recording engineers are Colin Underleiter and Cabby at Cabby Sound Studios in Santa Fe. Technical direction and post-production audio by Edwin R. Ruiz. Our executive producer is Daniel Zillman. Thank you to New Mexico artist El Brujo de Santinava for our theme music. For a full transcript and show notes, visit podcast.nmculture.org or click the link in the episode description in your listening app. I'm your host, Emily Withnall. The New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs is your guide to the state's entire family of museums, historic sites, and cultural institutions. From native treasures to space exploration, world-class folk art to ancient dinosaurs, our favorite way to fully explore is with the New Mexico Culture Pass. To see everywhere Culture Pass is accepted and reserve yours today, visit nmculture.org/visit/culturepass. And if you love New Mexico, you'll love El Palacio magazine. Subscribe at elpalacio.org. Thank you for listening. And if you learned something new, send this episode to a friend or share it on social media. We love celebrating the cultures of New Mexico together.